everyone, and thank you for joining me. I'm Tracy Harris, and this is At Home in My Head, the podcast that explores life in the cottage at Woodland Corners. Once when I was little, I was playing with some other kids. I jumped out and scared one, and they were terrified. Without even thinking, they automatically reacted by taking what they had in their hand and throwing it at me as hard as they could. Their aim was actually spectacular, and they hit me square in the head, right between the eyes. The fear on their face was clear, and their reaction was absolutely not punitive, but defensive and automatic. Being a child, I got mad and chased them down. But even as a kid, mad as I was about being hit in the face, I knew it was my own fault. Blaming them was not justified, and because my blame was unjustified, my response, to angrily chase them down, was unjust. It's a very simplified scenario, but this is what we mean when we call something an injustice, penalizing someone for something when it's unfair to do so. As an adult, I still understand it was my fault. I also realize now that I could have been blinded had their aim been slightly to the left or right, but no matter how damaged I might have been, it still would have been my fault, not their fault. I recently watched a video series called The Scary Snowman. It's pretty straightforward. A guy wears a snowman suit that sports an angry face, while a friend hides and films him. The snowman stands motionless on a busy downtown street, and occasionally, as folks walk by, the snowman turns his head or lurches forward, and sometimes just leans over towards someone on the street. What's interesting is that even minor movement by the snowman elicits a broad range of reactions. Most people scream and jump. Some run. A few actually dropped things they were carrying, like coffee or keys or cell phones. This last list could result in someone being burned or keys going down a sewer grate or a cell phone breaking, types of actual damages. Less commonly, someone hits or kicks the snowman. In one video, someone actually lays him out on the sidewalk. I talked a bit on social media about how unfair it is to blame someone for how they respond when we scare them and do things that can reasonably be understood as actions that would cause a person to experience feelings of fright or threat. I honestly might not have intuitively predicted that the scary snowman would frighten people as much as he does by just leaning over a few inches, but after watching a few reactions, it becomes clear that despite my inability to predict, it's reasonable to assume that a common response is going to be extreme fright and will elicit involuntary reactions from people. I have seen other types of scare videos that involve stalking people at night, things that I've literally thought could get people injured or killed if someone were to react strongly. One friend on my feed said she has PTSD and things that give her immediate frights are traumatizing. She noted that for a good part of her life, people found her responses funny, but they aren't funny to her. A few people noted they have fighting backgrounds with martial arts, and certain types of scares would be dangerous if done to them. When we put people in situations where they become scared, threatened, or desperate, we can't really predict what they might do. Reactions will vary. In the Scary Snowman videos, some people even laughed. A few folks went back to tell the snowman thank you because they actually enjoyed jumping and screaming. It was a broad range of unexpected results, but the bottom line is that when I create things like stress, fear, pressure, threat, I lose the ability to predict how a reasonable person will respond because I'm creating a situation and forcing them into a context where a reasonable person will do unpredictable things. And until I start to see how it unfolds, I won't know what the impact will be of the situation I'm imposing. There is no normal response to an abnormal situation. It's not reasonable to frighten random people on the street, and it's certainly not reasonable to judge them for their responses or to deny we're responsible for the reactions we elicit when we create such a scenario. The only thing I can be sure of is that whatever happens, I bear responsibility. Social oppression works very similarly. It puts pressure on people in various forms and asks them to shoulder that extra burden and stress while the rest of us ignore it and pretend it's not happening. That we aren't doing anything to anyone and it's all business as usual. It's like putting water in a pot on a stove and turning up the heat while simultaneously securing the lid as forcefully as we can to try and keep the contents from escaping. When we throw people into a pot, the only thing I know for sure is that some of them are going to do whatever it takes to get out of that pot. And if or when that pot explodes when the lid blows off, we can't really act surprised. We can't blame the people being boiled for how they react to defend themselves. Social oppression is cumulative, but even so, it can range from mildly annoying to downright lethal. A group may face stereotypes tied to historic context, but be in good shape as far as modern social health metrics like housing, income, mental and physical health. Another group may face unpredictable violence on the street from strangers. I might roll my eyes at Italian stereotypes, but when I walk out my front door, I don't fear someone physically assaulting me or yelling a slur at me because I'm Italian. I don't walk out of a job interview wondering if I'll be denied the position because I'm Italian. Folks in other demographics do have to face these concerns every time they leave the house or interview for a job. People who've been physically abused simply for existing, or who see headlines of others within their communities facing physical abuse in public spaces, are justified in feeling unsafe when they step out into public spaces. The rest of us who aren't in their community are not justified in judging how they respond to the knowledge that strangers sometimes spontaneously become violent toward people like them in public spaces, or feel comfortable harassing them, shouting at them, slurring them. I don't know what it's like. I can relate to some scenarios where, as a woman, I feel fearful because I'm a woman in a particular situation, but I can't relate to feeling that all the time from everyone. And I'm not saying everyone within a marginalized community expresses the same experience. I'm saying that when we treat people this way in our society, when we put them in the hot pot, reactions will vary. We can't predict them, and we aren't justified to judge the range of what we get back from the society we create and maintain, where some people are told loud and clear they are unsafe. As a cis woman, when you put me in a situation where I've been handed social messaging telling me I'm unsafe, I don't accept judgments from the people who put me in the pot about how I should or should not respond. People will react to threats to defend themselves however they need to. This is not unreasonable. And the dominant culture should not be surprised to see reactions that are not mundane when people are denied something as simple as a self-directed life. Marginalized literally means that a group is being pushed to the margins of the social architecture, away from where we keep our positions of power, survival resources, and basic access to what's required to have security and some level of control over our own lives. The more marginalized people become, the more disenfranchised they feel. We won't feel engaged and invested in a social architecture when we're denied due process, for example. Instead, we'll lose faith in the justice system and start to operate outside of it. The social contract is about the benefits and obligations of citizens and the benefits and obligations of the society. We can't ask or expect people to work with us toward benefiting society if they aren't receiving any social appreciation or benefit back. If my society won't provide for my safety and welfare, won't grant me access to resources and power positions, why should I provide for my society? Why should I care about a society that doesn't care about me? Why should I be obligated to respect laws I had no hand in creating because I was denied a vote or a voice? And being denied a vote doesn't just mean that law forbids it. It can mean that the social architecture is such that I'm denied opportunities for economic success, forced to work a job on a clock in a life where I'm barely getting by, and where the legislature, none or most of whom share any of my socially assigned identities, have just passed laws that limit the hours I can vote to the hours I need to be working in order to have housing or food that week. If someone keeps getting screwed over by the society, eventually they stop caring about the society and they stop cooperating. They become more self-focused because we're telling them that they need to get what they need on their own because we aren't going to make it accessible to them as a society. When someone rejects the society, the laws, refuses to cooperate, the first question should be whether that society is providing for that person as much as we provide for others. If not, then we're responsible for disenfranchising that person and for the harm that follows. No one is obligated to care about a society that doesn't care about them. When we create and perpetuate an unsafe context for some demographic, we lose the right to judge the responses. All we have in our scenario are obligations. The obligation to turn off the heat and get them out of the pot. Only after we've provided them safety, security, and a real commitment to their success can we begin to think about asking them to support the society. Instead, what I've been seeing are people shoving others into pots, turning up the heat, and then vilifying the people in the pot for exploding or running all over the sides or staying in the pot to boil because they feel so disempowered after being boiled for so long. I've seen a few examples in recent weeks of this particular brand of victim blaming, of oppressors blaming people they oppress for how they react. It's a way of ignoring my responsibility for creating the situation and pretending the people I oppress are responsible in part or in whole for being in the pot I put them in. It's like saying, see, you explode and run all over the sides. It's chaos. The way you behave, that's why we keep you in a pot. Just look at you. When I had Eric Harmon on, he said his next documentary would be called Oppression 101 and examine tactics by oppressors that seem to be nearly universally employed regardless of the demographics being oppressed. I think very often society is like the scary snowman, except we want to sue the person who punches us when we terrified them on the street. We want to ignore our responsibility for literally creating the problem and causing someone else trauma or fear that resulted in us getting punched in the head, or declare the person who punched us a violent predator that needs a healthy dose of law and order imposed to control them. We don't want to expose the part of the video where we surprised or frightened someone for our own benefit. We skip right over that part and say, look at how I got punched in the head. This person is a social menace. This is what was so obscene about January 6th. On January 6th, the people exploding were the very people who own and control all the pots and stoves. They have heavy investment in the boiling pot system because it benefits them when everyone else is busy trying to survive because it provides more opportunities for them. It speaks volumes that some people traveled to protest that day on private planes, but they're frantically trying to secure the lids against what they see as massive explosions about to happen if they don't push people back into those pots and get those lids more secure. That's the abortion laws. That's the voter restrictions. Don't turn down the flames and help people out of those boiling pots. Turn the heat up and push the lid down harder. It's a devastating and costly strategy just to keep a grip on their privilege. But not all explosions happen because people are oppressed. Sometimes it's the oppressors who explode because privilege is currency. As a side note, it's good to remember that as someone who's not in the pot and who is therefore part of a system where I benefit from others being boiled in the pot, that it's not constructive to tell the people we're boiling how to handle being boiled. That actually pisses off a lot of people I'm boiling. I should address my energy to my own oppressor community and do all I can to get them to join me in turning off the heat and getting people out of the pots. Until that happens, I should probably only engage the folks being boiled to support their efforts to exit the pots or eliminate the heat, however they decide to do that. The black-on-black crime trope used by many racists is a great example of how oppressors blame people they oppress. Higher crime correlates to increased poverty, which comes with a lack of education, housing, and economic opportunity, which results in a scarcity of survival resources. We can't create and maintain a social structure that puts particular groups into ghettos and then act surprised to see a rise in crime. Again, there can be diverse responses, but increasing crime is a known risk with increased poverty. Additionally, policing is generally more gentle in affluent neighborhoods. So we also perpetuate the high crime in economically depressed and deprived communities with more aggressive policing. Then we penalize people with prison records, making opportunities for them even more scarce, and round we go. I want to add a content warning to this next section. It includes a brief reference to the trans community and suicide. So let me pause for a moment to give you time to fast forward if you need to. I'll provide timestamps in the description to help folks out with that. One of the worst examples of someone blaming the people in the pot was someone defending an individual that had been called out by the trans community for turning up the heat under them. I'll issue a disclaimer that I don't know if this story has any truth, but it doesn't actually matter for the purposes of illustration. The story was that after the trans community called out a cis person for increasing oppression against their community, a trans person defended the cis oppressor, who was their friend. The trans community pushed back, and the individual who had defended their friend ended their life. The implication was that because of pushback from the trans community, this person died. Every now and then, someone will do a thing that makes trans lives a hot topic in many public settings, where the issue is difficult to avoid. When this happens, some trans people experience increased distress. The community itself experiences incredibly high rates of self-harm and suicide in response to being targeted for public harassment, abuse, and violence. There is research that indicates when they are allowed to exist in a supportive environment, the mental health concerns reduce to levels in line with those of cis people. So what causes some of those folks to walk on a knife's edge of safety is people like me, cis people, my people. We are the ones who make the rules and the architecture. We are the ones saying the nasty things. And yes, some of us try to be supportive, but that's actually our obligation. If I benefit from you being boiled in a pot, I owe it to you to help you get out of the pot. Otherwise, I'm literally saying I will let you be boiled if it benefits me. And yes, I suppose that's an option, but I'm mainly trying to talk to people who aren't that person. It isn't generous or magnanimous to get people out of those pots. We aren't doing them a favor. We're doing what we're obligated to do when we call out other cis people and stand up for trans people and communities. I'll just add here as a bonus that this is why it's a really bad idea to make trans people a topic on a large platform when it isn't about serving their community. Even when it's necessary to serve their community, like when there's someone doing violence to them or stripping their rights in the news and we need to confront it, it's still really unsafe for a lot of trans people when headlines splash and public discourse turns the spotlight on them. Even when the attention is about an effort to support that community, the conversation will absolutely attract trans bigots everywhere. So cis people who decide to wade into those waters need to collaborate with the trans community. When cis people generate casual headlines about trans people, they need to be sure trans people are on board, and also that they, as a cis person, are capable of doing what is necessary for that community to keep them safe because they are risking that community's safety. Cis people created the unsafe social structure around the trans community that results in more mental stress and self-harm within that community. Trans people did not put themselves in the pot and turn up the heat. I, as a cis person, and the guy telling the story, put trans people in the pot. Then one of our cis community members turned up the heat on them a little more. And the trans people in the pot started to shout and bang on the pot and tell us to cut it out. He and I, the people boiling them, don't get to judge how they respond to being boiled. One of them, being friends with the person who turned up the heat, felt loyalty and defended him. And cis people also don't get to judge how that one person handled being boiled. But other people being boiled, they still get to defend themselves against being boiled, even when the person perpetuating it is one of their own. When I start harming people and they fight back, and someone who cares about me gets between me and them to defend me, whatever happens, I'm responsible. What made this particularly egregious was that the person didn't really understand the type of context that puts trans people at risk. He was trying to leverage mental health issues and suicide risk to attack the trans community, thereby ignoring the cis community's responsibility for creating the pot and turning on the heat, as well as ignoring the cis person who turned up the heat further. So he was wrongly indicting the trans community in order to blame them for something he and I are responsible for perpetrating and obligated to correct. And in doing so, he actually turned the heat up even further, doing even more cis damage. And because this unfolded on social media at my account, I'm responsible for whatever damage occurred there, which is why I finally took steps to put a stop to it after trying to raise awareness in the individual expressing this hostility toward the trans community. Interestingly, this all unfolded after I had logged another event that used the same pattern of an oppressor blaming the people they oppress. I had planned to discuss that one, but the former example simply coincided before I sat down to script this episode. A while back, I did an episode called One Man's Privilege. It was an example of a guy who ignored the misogyny of chivalric codes and tried to pit women against one another based on how they responded to male oppressive systems. The short version is a woman complained a date didn't open doors for her. He complained men can't do that anymore because other women complain about it being sexist. So put women in the pot of misogynistic chivalry, then tell the ones who remain sitting in the pot to blame the ones running over the sides because if they just stayed in the pot as well, they could all boil together and at least he'd know what the deal was. Granted, opening doors or not can seem minor relative to some other forms of oppression, but that was also part of the story. He decided to make this his issue during the time the headlines were carrying stories about states like Texas and Missouri passing extreme and restrictive legislation to dehumanize women. So instead of supporting the people in the pot against the people outside the pot, his people, he decided to turn up the heat that week just a smidge, but that was his contribution to building a better society. Then he did it again. I posted a clipping about a man who was sad that his partner broke up with him. He decided to play piano outside in public for all to see, including her, to get her attention and win her back, to show her how much he loved her and how wrong she was to leave him. I added the following comment when I posted this clip. It's not the smell of desperation, it's the reek of entitlement. I wish we would stop romanticizing this garbage. This is the ideology that fuels the guy who gets violent when she, quote, tries to leave. I love you. I want to be with you. It's painful to be without you. These are reasons to work on getting over it and getting a therapist to help you if you have trouble getting over it. None of that is sufficient justification for someone else to be with me. None of that means someone else has to want to be with me. It's not flattering when someone you've left goes to extreme lengths to be around you or get your attention. And for women, there's no way to tell the guy who will eventually move on from the one who's going to show up at your door with a weapon declaring that if he can't have you, no one else will. It should be noted that this type of obsession is not gender exclusive, but women are more likely to be murdered by a partner or ex-partner. And that was my original commentary to the clip that I posted. The conversation in the comments was mainly around the toxicity of this type of obsessive behavior and how our society needs to do a better job of teaching healthier alternatives and teach people to respect the autonomy of others. All of us have to learn at some point that how we feel about things isn't how everyone else feels. Not everyone likes chocolate ice cream or cake, and sometimes we have feelings of affection for a person, and that person doesn't have similar feelings for us. We're a lot better at understanding the situation in reverse. When someone wants to have a relationship with us and we don't share that desire, we want to be understood and not vilified or stalked. And when we want that from someone else, and they don't feel similarly, we should offer that same understanding and respect for their decision. Yes, it can hurt to have to go through the withdrawal and grief and loss of a relationship, but in the end, if we're going to respect other people as human beings, we have to respect their autonomy and their decisions about what's best for them, just as we'd expect to be respected ourselves. So Mr. Privilege hit the thread right out of the box with this. Women aren't innocent in perpetuating this behavior. I know a lot of women who admit to causing drama or walking out because they want to be pursued. They feed off gestures like this. Not to say that this is healthy behavior on either side, but it's a mistake to shame men when women are equally guilty of this nonsense. End quote. Looking back, I find his use of the word shame to be revealing. Why did he interpret my post as shaming? I said that what the man in the article was demonstrating was not desperation but entitlement. His stated position was that he should get what he wants because he wants it a lot, even though it's another human being and not some form of mindless property. A human being who has explained they no longer want to be in a relationship with him. I said that I wished we would stop romanticizing this. I used inclusive language, not divisive language. I said that loving someone and wanting to be with them and experiencing pain at that loss should be understood as an impetus to work through the grief so as to get past it, as opposed to refusing to let it go and stalking or harassing my ex-partner. And if I experience real trouble moving on, I can seek help to work through it if I can't process it on my own. I've personally had some tough breakups. I get how painful it can be. I also recall one specifically I should probably have gotten help getting over. I was much younger, and today I wouldn't have so much trouble with it, but I was not being flippant when I said that if you find yourself unable to move on, you can reach out for help with grief counseling or standard therapy. I take pain seriously, but I don't condone using pain as an excuse to disrespect other people who aren't doing anything to harm us. If someone doesn't want to be in a relationship with me, that isn't harm to me, even though I may experience pain. I can't ask someone to stay in a relationship with me where they don't want to be because it'll be painful if I lose them. In fact, it would be just as painful if they stayed and I saw every day how unhappy they were with me. It's just the reality of human associations. And my response to other people wanting to be with me or not is mine to deal with. If I can't let go, I need to get help to learn to let it go, and I would not shame someone for that. I then noted that while it's portrayed as flattering to be stalked and disrespected, when it happens in reality, it's often falling on a range from annoying to actually frightening. Also, in reality, this type of inability to move on can result in disproportionate violence against women, including lethal violence. I also noted that people of any gender can be obsessive. It isn't just men. It's just that women are more at risk of more severe forms of violence, including death, as a result of it. So where did I shame men? I don't believe I did, but Mr. Privilege certainly processed this criticism as shaming. I didn't issue any shame. I merely indicated responsibility and consequences as someone in a pot that he stands outside of. I replied to him that, quote, "The women who buy into this are victims of systemic misogyny. They are also victims of a system that literally kills them for this shit. Stop blaming the people you oppress." He replied to declare that men are victims of this as well. So I asked him, who runs the society? Who makes the movies? Who are the CEOs buying the ads? Do you think women are in charge of the Western world? Men are the victims of what? The culture they create and perpetuate? Stop blaming the people you oppress for their oppression. He countered that, quote, "Sorry you don't understand what it's like to be victimized as a man. Women have tremendous power, and many of them know it and use it. It's just a different kind of power." A friend of mine stepped in to remind him that whatever he's perceiving as victimization, he's entering a conversation that's talking about how the results for women in these situations rise to the level of sexual violence and homicide. He dismissed her comment by posting back a link to the red herring fallacy with no comment whatsoever because he was unable to understand the point she was making. It was the same point I had considered in his prior post about holding doors in the middle of national news about women's reproductive rights potentially being stripped. Don't get me wrong. I fully accept that men are harmed by sexist systems, even when they act as the oppressor class. But when this happens, it's men harming each other, not empowered women harming disempowered men. It's not women putting men in the pot. It's men putting women in the pot and damaging one another in the process. A good example is the military draft. The idea that young men would be drafted was tied to the idea that women were incapable of military combat roles, which are the types of roles the draft was aiming to fill. Women in the military have tried for a long time to be allowed into combat roles because it opens up opportunities for advancement. These roles were denied to women as a means to limit their success in the military and were informed by misconceptions about the capabilities of women. Women pushed and gained access to combat roles, and now the draft can be re-examined to include women, or we can abolish it. But the male-only draft was a product of beliefs about male superiority and the inferiority of women. It was still women in the pot, even though there was some not insignificant damage done to some young men. But that's not what Mr. Privilege is trying to express. He isn't saying that sexism against women also harms men. He's saying that women have power and do harm to men and to themselves. In fact, what he's doing is judging and blaming women for how they respond to being in the pot. One woman works within that system, and he demonizes her. Another woman, like me, declares the system has to end, and I'm shaming men and need to blame other women just as much for how they respond to being boiled. He's in the group that put women in the pot and turned up the heat, and he was now on a thread where he was turning up the heat even more by saying that he doesn't like how some women respond to his oppression. Literally, oppression in the form of sexual violence and murder. Women are not supposed to find a way to empower themselves. They're just supposed to comply and die. It reminds me of how women were barred from access to resources in such overt ways in the past. And when some women developed the strategy of giving men what they wanted from women in order to access the most resources possible, they were vilified as gold diggers or worse. When we put people in the pot and turn up the heat, we have no justification to complain about how people choose to defend themselves. If someone in the pot finds a way to make life bearable or even good for themselves using our oppressive architecture, we don't get to complain. And if we don't like it and need someone to blame, we need to find a mirror. So I tried to offer more clarity in response as follows. He had said, "Okay, I'm getting the message. In all instances, blame the male. Brilliant." I responded, "Please let me know which of the formal power structures in the U.S. you think women own and control that influence society's social metrics. Honestly, who do you think owns, operates, and controls the society? Where is this mythical power that women wield over the society? Because it's not government, it's not capital, it's not the justice system, it's not media, it's not educational institutions, it's not medical leadership. Where are women heading up the architecture of this society? Where are we doing anything but responding and reacting to a male social architecture? We should blame the people who have the power to craft the society, and that's not women, and has not been for thousands of years in the West. If the power you are claiming women have or use is sexual power, then you can blame men absolutely for creating and perpetuating that. If you want it to change, complaining to women isn't the answer. Getting them real power is what will change that. Elect them to office, appoint them as judges, hire them as college directors, make them head of the AMA and the APA, hire them as CEOs. If you really want women to stop leaning on or using men for fake proxy power, then do all you can to get them real power. I guarantee you that when women start to access real power, they won't lean on men. And we see this already in the numbers of divorces initiated by women and how women are delaying marriage and childbearing or forgoing it completely as they begin to have access to more capital and resources independently. But many men fight against this, as you're doing on this thread, because they don't want women to have real power. They want them to remain subhuman sexual objects for men and just stop complaining about it or not appreciating men oppressing them, which men often repackage as benevolence. You actually did this yourself recently on one of your posts, again, perpetuating this system you're here to say victimizes you. I also addressed his red herring link in response to one of my other friends in the thread. I said that her comment is not a red herring. Quote, "She's trying to assist you in seeing your privilege. You are complaining about the discomfort you feel when women don't comply with your sexual expectations in the same system where women cope with being sexually violated and murdered by men in a system men control. It's like someone eating in a fancy restaurant and complaining about the starving homeless people outside the window ruining their meal. You don't see yourself. She's trying to help you. Being confronted with the responses and reactions to a system of oppression you actually perpetuate is not victimization. The person at dinner may feel uncomfortable and not like the view, but their privileged social advantage is what is creating the homeless situation they don't want to see. The fact that the people outside the window want access to the food is not what is causing the problem. You need to dive deeper. You should be thanking her, not dismissing her. You also did this previously on your own wall when you lodged a similar complaint while at the same time women were facing the first cracks in Roe v. Wade. Your contribution was to attack women for some perceived petty grievance that was actually created by an antiquated misogynistic system. He then tried another tactic. He left off the thread on my account and reached out to PM me. I generally don't like people to do that, to move a conversation from a thread to a PM, without a very good reason for doing so. In this case, there was his stated reason, but then there was also a subtext that was pretty evident as well. Just to note a few things. First, while I love being able to use examples from real life, my goal is not to embarrass anyone or violate anyone's privacy. As much as possible, I'd like to keep people anonymous. Identity rarely matters when it comes to examining interactions on social media, and I would simply like to share some of my exchange to help clarify points using real-world examples without intruding on anyone's personal situation. The context of the atheist community is included in his part of the conversation. I personally am no longer active in that community, and I will share my feedback in the context that he's providing, but I wouldn't have personally chosen that as my own context. I didn't reply to his PM, but I will give my thoughts as I'm reading through it, and I think you'll get a feel for why I decided not to respond. He starts out by saying that the atheist community has changed a lot. He says, quote, "There were rumblings back then with the need for social justice, the whole atheism plus that came and went. I didn't pay it much attention as I was more concerned with creating an inclusive environment for atheists to have a place to connect." End quote. Let me just add here that it's always so obvious to me that we can't really create an inclusive space for atheists without social justice. We can't have a white space with racist ideas existing and also have a space where Black atheists will feel comfortable spending time. We can't have a male space where sexist ideas thrive and still have non-men feel comfortable spending time there. You can't really achieve inclusivity without ensuring that people understand what welcoming means. To say you don't pay attention to social justice because you're busy trying to create inclusive spaces is like saying you don't pay much attention to seatbelts and airbags because you're too busy trying to engineer safe cars. He goes on, quote, "Unfortunately, the majority of atheist groups and leaders have fallen into the far-left woke cancel culture club and haven't been welcoming to all people like they were in the past. The attitude is get on board with our ideology or get out," end quote. This one is really bizarre. There's been an ongoing dialogue about the lack of diversity in atheist spaces. Black non-believers and women of color beyond belief, which I just attended virtually, are still addressing how unwelcoming atheist spaces can be for them. These groups exist because they've not felt welcome or included. So the idea that there was some past where all people were welcome in those spaces is a fantasy that is demonstrated by how many people in marginalized groups have expressed openly that they have not felt welcome in those spaces. What he's actually saying is that the call to create actually inclusive spaces where people who aren't just like him feel honestly welcome and not persecuted don't allow him to comfortably express himself, and that actually speaks volumes. What's interesting is that, again, most minorities have carved out their own spaces at this point, and so he's effectively saying that whatever limited diversity is tolerated is still too much for him. He talks about a private, personal, life-changing event that he went through and says that, quote, "I've decided that only things that bring joy and peace into my life are things I want to focus on," unquote. So keep in mind that the few recent interactions I've had have been him turning up the heat on women in the pot that men created and placed them in. Is this what brings him joy and peace? He goes on, quote, "This latest attempt to share my personal experience on your page and being shouted down, shamed, and lambasted just reminded me it's not worth the effort," unquote. There were maybe half a dozen other people on the thread. Most of them posted no more than a line or two. There was no shouting down, shaming, or lambasting. In fact, one woman I know personally who tried to engage him isn't even capable of being aggressive. She has difficulty just being assertive. When she tried non-aggressively to engage him on the thread, he dismissed her out of hand, and while he complains about feeling disrespected on a thread about threats and violence against women, where he tried to blame the people he oppresses, he has no idea that this woman he so dismissively brushed off has undergone a life-altering experience as well. She is the victim of a brutal sexual assault at the hands of a prior male partner. He came on the thread to turn up the heat under a pot other people are in, and then he has the audacity to complain about his feeling ill-treated. Most folks hardly said anything to him, and I actually took the time to offer 2 comments, the only long comments on that thread, to try and help him understand the issue. And that's what abuse looks like to you when you're privileged. He also added that by offering an opposing view, he had, quote, paid for it. Literally, he got half a dozen replies, most of which were nothing, and I was the only one who responded, and I offered points for him to consider. He didn't even try to clarify his position beyond his original comment, and the way he describes it, you'd think he'd actually labored to try and help people understand. He didn't even bother to address any of the points raised in response to him. He did no emotional labor on the thread at all. It was barely more than a hit and run where he didn't even bother to engage. Then he leaves the thread and assumes he's deserving of more of my time and attention after totally ignoring my comments to him. He wants my attention, but he gives none. He's entitled. No one else is entitled. Just as he's entitled to feel welcome in spaces where he has no obligation to work to ensure anyone else feels welcome. That's too social justice-y for him, and he doesn't have time for that nonsense. He goes on, quote, "I've found a community that prioritizes empathy, kindness, understanding, and grace," end quote. So the guy who dismisses a sexual assault survivor, ignores a woman who tries to engage him, chooses a thread about violence against women to say women bring it on themselves, fits right in with a community that promotes empathy, kindness, understanding, and grace? I will leave that one right there. He says the atheist community, and I think he's implying by extension my page, even though it hasn't been an atheist-focused space for years now, is angry, divisive, coercive, and manipulative. His words. Again, his focus has been on attacking women for how they respond to his oppression, and he's accusing others of all these things. Next he says, quote, "These are the values held by the far left and right. The ideologies are in opposition, but the tone and tactics are the same." Here, he's really digging in. And I notice this especially because I've seen it so often. This is the both sides tactic. He notes the ideologies are not the same, but the tone and tactics are the same. Interestingly, I agree. The ideologies are different. One group has an ideology that's about putting people in pots and turning up the heat. The other group has an ideology that's about doing whatever is necessary to dismantle those pots. Do you remember what I said about January 6th? I didn't say that the tactics were wrong. I said that the motivation was wrong. I was clear. If these people were boiling in pots, I would understand the explosion. But it's not acceptable to me to see people exploding because they can't abuse other people. That's crap. The problem has never been tactics. It's always been ideology. What he's saying is that if I try to murder someone and they kill me while trying to defend their own lives, we're both guilty of using the same tactics, even though we have different motives. I mean, of course. That's absolutely correct. But is that really a problem? When people's lives and health and safety and security are on the line, isn't that the most justified time to go to the wall? The note itself was framed as a sign-off, as a disassociation. It was more than that, though. It was a way to get in final digs privately, to offer a fairly ridiculous excuse for disassociating. Nobody needs a reason to disassociate with someone else. He owed me nothing, but opted to send me something. What he sent, though, was cowardly. If he had the capacity to type a goodbye that long, he could have at least responded to any of the points I'd raised in the thread. Instead, he declared he was shouted down and shamed, which I continue to insist is an internalized response that he's inserting into this situation. I had many other cishet men on that thread who did not express they felt shamed by the post or the comments. In fact, they were very supportive and understanding. These are not people in a pot with a fire underneath in this scenario. These are people with the luxury to be standing outside the pot, with the capacity to comfortably process things without pressure. Mr. Privilege can heap abuse on women on the thread, turning up the heat and walking away without a scratch on him. Nobody on that thread had any authority over him or ability to harm him. He's not going to be marginalized as a cishet white man because of our observations on the OP scenario we were discussing. The thread was intended to support all victims of oppressive partners, but yes, especially point out the added violence and risk that women face in this society in the same scenario from men. Mr. Privilege hoped to say that women bring this on themselves, and that's not his lane. Women in the pot can address other women in the pot about the best way to deal with being boiled alive by a male-dominated society, but men can help by addressing other men about getting us out of the pot and turning off the fire. I'm happy to say that a few men on the thread were doing just that, trying to get Mr. Privilege to understand that the best way to change this for everyone is to use that structural power at his fingertips to stop boiling women so that women can stop reacting to pressure from men and begin leading self-directed lives. What I gave Mr. Privilege was an opportunity to learn, and he labeled it as shaming and shouting down. This allowed him to dismiss every point I made out of hand without having to actually admit I had offered him any explanations, without responding to me at all. But he doesn't want to examine what I have to say. He'd rather say it's shaming and shouting down so he can pretend he's justified in ignoring it, and then he doesn't have to self-reflect in order to answer it. I'd like to shift gears here to say that I'm humbled by the people who've reached out to sponsor the podcast. I absolutely don't expect it, but I admit there's something about seeing people letting me know that they value the content and want to support the work. And I just wanted to tell you thank you, and I appreciate the gesture. That's it for this episode of At Home in My Head, exploring life in the cottage at Woodland Corners. Thanks for listening, and as always, stay safe, be well, and never stop exploring.